Provost, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, pray silence for your chairman, Robert Speaight, Esquire, the President, who will propose the toast of the evening, the memory of Sir Walter Scott, the President.
My Lord Provost, Mrs. Maxwell Scott, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, one of our more colourful Secretaries of State for Foreign Affairs found himself seated next to the ambassadress of a neighbouring power with whom our relations, I am thankful to say, continue to be friendly. She was a lady of quite exceptional charms, and although he had not met her before, he was quick to get negotiations off the ground. "You are a very beautiful woman," he said. "I expect you have been told that many times before." "Yes," she replied, "but not before the soup." If I were to tell you how privileged I feel to occupy this chair tonight, I shall be telling you nothing that you have not been told many times before. And I should have been quite prepared had the opportunity been afforded me to tell you so before the soup. The privilege is such as dreams are made of. And I have no doubt, after the bountiful hospitality that you've extended to my wife and myself, that the realization of this one will be rounded with a sleep. But as I recall the roll of honor of those who have stood and spoken from this chair, I might well subside with a sense of my own unworthiness long before I came upon those names which I could pronounce with a measure of familiarity. Malcolm Muggeridge, Ludovic Kennedy, these give me the reassurance, not indeed of an equal footing, but at least a reminder of faces that I should recognize if I met them in the street, and to which I should raise my hat if I had one. Behind them, however, there rise up the forbidding profiles of statesmen, prelates, judges, and even literary critics who have witnessed to their admiration of Walter Scott. I have small title to raise my own voice where such advocates have not feared to tread. My credentials, however, meager as they may well appear, are, as you will see, in one respect exceptional. I have, it is true, no drop of Scottish blood. I was 30 years old before I set foot across the border. All I knew of Scotland was the Flying Scotsman as it thundered through the station at Hatfield, a station now robbed, I am sorry to say, of its endearing eccentricity. It was years before I ventured further north than Hitchin, but I was no stranger to Sir Walter Scott. As I devoured his novels, 2 columns to a page, in the camp bed, where during the summer months I used to sleep in an open loggia. As the twilight deepened, the small print became illegible, and the iron tongue, not of midnight, but of 9 p.m., told me that it was time to dream. They were not the best novels. They were not the Scots novels, where Sir Walter is writing from personal experience or of history that he had learnt from hearsay. The Lowlanders of Bailey Jarvie or Ede Ochiltree would have quite defeated my understanding. Never mind. Whenever Scott condescended to cross the Cheviots or the Channel, and his readiness to do so was not unrelated to his popularity with the English reader, I was alert to welcome him. Of course, there was nothing exceptional in all this, but the sequel was, I think, exceptional, if not unique. I was then boarding at a private school at Hove, where at the age of 12 I contracted a mysterious fever. We were attended by a physician called Uthoff, of German extraction and sinister aspect, whose curly grey hair, saturnine stoop, and high domed forehead reminded me of Dr. Moriarty. My persisting fever completely baffled him until, pocketing his stethoscope, he produced his desperate diagnosis. This boy's temperature, he declared roundly, is due to an excessive reading of the works of Sir Walter Scott. Peveril of the Peak or another was taken away from me, Micah Clark was put in its place, and my temperature obediently returned to normal. Many a boy's pulse is quickened when Scott's narrative gathers, not without preliminary digression, to its head. But has anyone else been so excited by Sir Walter Scott that his pulse threatened no longer to beat at all? Now that the bicentennial junketings are done with, the aftermath may give us the sensation of a hangover. The exhibitions are dismantled, the reassessments have had a run for their money, the orators are silent, present company excepted. Sir Walter broods under his baldacchino over an Edinburgh that goes about its daily business. What then are we left with? We are left with all that matters. We are left with the books. What do they say to us? Not very much, comes the easy, unconsidered verdict. Ludovic Kennedy was telling you a year or two ago how widely Scott is in fact read today, and he had gone to immense trouble to find out. But for the most part, the readers of Scott are secret readers. They are the people who read, not the people who tell us what we ought or ought not to read. They compose a freemasonry of devotees only lacking some peculiar handshake or significant wink by which they recognize each other. It is as if we knew that Scott stands in four-square opposition to so many tendencies of the times, to all those things against which Malcolm Muggeridge was launching his anathemas from this presidential chair and even from the pulpit of John Knox himself. I am the last person to solicit the approbation of that unlovable divine, but here I don't mind ringing my bell while Mr. Muggeridge brandishes his book and candle. The reason for this silence and secrecy about Walter Scott, bicentenaries notwithstanding, is not that he wrote at the beginning of a century that now seems as dead as the dodo. Jane Austen was his contemporary and his admirer, and even Dr. Leavis will not exclude Jane Austen from his royal enclosure. Burns was also his contemporary, and there never was a more permissive poet than Burns. So was Byron, and whatever people may think about Byron's poetry, and Scott thought it so much better than his own that he stopped writing poetry altogether, the private life of Byron is more fascinating for many people than the public life of anyone else. Carlyle was another contemporary, but then Carlyle wrote about revolutions, and revolutions are always popular unless you happen to get caught up in them. If you hanker after the 19th century's douceur de vivre, you will go to Disraeli. For its mirth and melodrama and materialism, its wild comedy and rampaging high spirits, you will go to Dickens. For its higher life, loftier sentiments and lower morals, you will go to Thackeray. But you will not go to Scott for any of these things, because Scott does not really belong to the 19th century at all. He belongs to the century that bred him, not to the century that took him to its heart. And yet, I've spoken of Scott brooding over Princes Street. But there is one thing that worries me about that statue under whose shadow we meet tonight. Scott is brooding over the wrong street. I'm second to none in my admiration for Princes Street as a thoroughfare. Vehicles can actually get through it. But its architecture, with a single noble exception, leaves me as cold or as hot as I suspect it would have left Sir Walter. But you will notice that he looks down, where the passengers look up, if they look up at all. Of course, you may argue that, broadly speaking, the statue faces the new town and the age of reason, and that this is appropriate because Scott was an eminently reasonable man. His favorite poets, Shakespeare always excepted, were Johnson and Crabbe, the quiet Suffolk clergyman whose verses he asked to be read to him when he was dying. But what kindled his imagination were the ages of violence that speak to us as they speak to him, from the precipitous and perspiring masonry of the Wines and the Royal Mile. Here was the Scotland of Henryson and Dunbar, the chivalry that perished at Flodden, the fidelities that were disappointed in the last chapter of Red Gauntlet. And so, if Scott were to be handed down to us looking up rather than looking down, he should have been looking up at that incomparable profile of the past which echoed and inspired his romanticism. Perhaps he should have been facing both ways, but that was one of those things in heaven and earth undreamt of by the aesthetics of the 19th century, although it has been revealed to the babes and sucklings of the 20th. A double-faced Sir Walter might have suggested the range of his writing, but it would have done a grave injustice to his character. Not long ago, my very good friend Murray Maclaren, whose recent death will have been a sadness to many of you, was standing on the mound in company with Georges Simenon. As they looked down upon the Scott Memorial, Simenon remarked that it was probably the most imposing monument ever erected to the memory of a great writer. And then he added this surprising tribute: he invented us all. What did he mean by it? Whom was he thinking of? I wish I had been there to ask him. Victor Hugo, perhaps. But it's a long haul back from Maigret to Les Miserables. Simenon, I think, was placing Scott at the head of a great pedigree of all those writers who are concerned, among other things, to tell a story and know that the gift of narrative is the golden key to immortality. Scott will never mean much to the fastidious perfectionists of style, and not much more, perhaps, to those who would rather find their characters on the psychiatrist's couch than booted and saddled on the battlefield or trudging the Great North Road. His appeal is to those who want to know what will happen in our next. And we only put him down when he keeps us waiting for too long. Not so far, then, from Maigret, after all. So, the admirers of Walter Scott need not be ashamed to hold their heads up. Let me recall to you one or two of their progeny, of his progeny, and you will see how little, in many cases, these tellers of tales resemble their grandfather. There was Dostoevsky, who read Scott at the age of 15, and yet it's much easier to imagine him reading Dickens. There was Balzac, who wrote that Scott's chief and splendid claim to originality is that he was the first novelist to relate man to the circumstances and traditions, political, moral, religious, and natural, of the society in which he lives. There was George Eliot, who spoke in Middlemarch of that beloved writer who was made a chief part in the happiness of so many young lives. And there was another whose name I will leave you to guess, although he has left a clue in the last sentence, or if you prefer, a pin in his bouquet. As a storyteller and entertainer, he beats hollow all the fearfully clever modern women whose books make one miserable. It's a case of Shakespeare and Scott first, and the rest, save one, nowhere. Which of us would have recommended The Pirate as holiday reading to George Bernard Shaw? Among those who have addressed this club, there was C.S. Lewis, who asked us to imagine what Dickens or George Moore would have made of Effie Deans, and then bade us turn to Scott and breathe the air of common sense. Indeed, it's not difficult to speculate how Dickens would have smothered her in sentiment and Moore in sensuality. Lewis had hard words for a modern critic, and I respect him too much to mention his name, who would have us believe that the only reason that Jeannie refused to tell a lie was because she was jealous of her sister. And if you're the kind of reader who must have angst at any price, Lewis recommended you to read the Gurnall. Lord Rosebery used to say that Scott's Gurnall and St. John's Gospel were the two most consoling books in the world. There's something extraordinarily moving in the thought of a man who had achieved his three ambitions: to win the Derby, to marry an heiress, and to become Prime Minister, turning for consolation to the journal of a man facing bankruptcy at the meridian of his fame. Like most people, I suppose, I like to do something different on Christmas Day. So, finding myself alone last Christmas, with no other company but my wife, I laid aside the books that I ought to have been reading and fished down from my shelves not the Gurnall, which I had read from cover to cover only recently, but Woodstock, the novel upon which Scott was at work when calamity threatened him on every side. I had not read it since I was a boy. Perhaps it was Woodstock that gave me that fever which defied all rational diagnosis. I was not only captivated by the story and by Scott's understanding of a climacteric in English history, but all the time I was thinking of his indefatigable pen, and what Lockhart called its dashing trot across the paper, while Charlotte was dying, and Ballantyne and Constable threatened to engulf him. That cap to any head that occurs to you. Perhaps Mr. Baldwin was right when he told the Cambridge Union that oratory was the harlot of the arts. Little as he knew about art, and even less, I suspect, about harlots. What was remarkable and refreshing about the Regius Professor's estimate of Scott was the tribute of a professional to an amateur historian. Although it's fair to add that, generally speaking, what the academics say about the amateurs is nothing to what they say about each other. The fact remains that the majority of great historians have been what Professor Dryasdust would describe as amateurs. Xenophon, Thucydides, Caesar, Tacitus, Chateaubriand, Winston Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle, none of these occupied professorial chairs. And you could add many other names to the list. Any painstaking person can fish up a fact from a parish register, but history is more than fact. History, as Michelet proclaimed in an immortal phrase, is the resurrection of the flesh. And this is as true of the historical novelist as it is of the scientific or philosophical historian. Moreover, although Scott occasionally got his facts askew, he fished for them as patiently as he fished for salmon in the Tweed. And you don't need to be a fisherman to know that facts can be as elusive as salmon. When Scott landed them and dressed them with his imaginative sympathy, history was indeed made flesh and dwelt among us. Lockhart wrote that Scott's service in repressing the revolutionary propensities of his age were far beyond the comprehension of vulgar politicians. They have not proved beyond the comprehension of politicians who no one could describe as vulgar. Doc Cooper once told me that he never let a year pass without reading one of the Waverley novels. And the late Lord Birkenhead read them all through every 5 years. How many of us, I wonder, could say as much? At these annual celebrations, one likes to think that Scott is among his friends, past as well as present. Are they so very different today? Are you so very different, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, from what they were at the time when Scott was the chief ornament of your society? In Edinburgh, a now forgotten novelist recalls for us, the ranks and fortunes being more on an equality, no one is able to greatly to exceed his neighbor in luxury and extravagance. Great magnificence and the consequent gratification produced by the envy of others being out of the question, the object for which a reunion of individuals was originally invented becomes less of a secondary consideration. Private parties for the actual purpose of society and conversation are frequent and answer the destined end. And in the societies of professed amusement are to be met the learned, the studious, and the rational, and presented as shown to the company by the host and hostess, but professedly seeking their own gratification. We cannot, of course, exempt Scott from the charge of extravagance, but no man ever realized his fantasy with less desire to excite the envy of others. and we can endorse the judgment of Lockhart that Scott's appetite for wealth was no more than a vivid yearning for the means of large beneficence. Political prigs will write this off as snobbery, but let them not forget that it was said of Scott that he speaks to every man as if they were blood relations. If Abbotsford, the romance in lime and stone, was his madness, it was also his monument, telling us more than the figure brooding under its baldacchino and wondering what the Edinburgh Festival is all about. If that inextinguishable spirit ever revisits the glimpses of its fame and comes to inhabit those rather careworn features, it may well recall the societies of professed amusement, where Charles Matthews set the table on a roar with his mimicry, and where John Philip Kemble shed his romanità over the champagne. Speaking as one who has spent much of his life before the footlights, though latterly somewhat withdrawn from them, if it were in my power to call back a moment from the past, I should transport myself not to Abbotsford, where the sad ghosts mingle with the merry ones, but to John Ballantyne's little villa, Trinity Grove he called it, near the New Haven Road on the Firth of Forth. Scott used to say that John was like a cat because he could tumble out of a 10-pair of stairs window and light on his feet. And he had certainly tumbled out of his financial troubles into a pretty share of the royalties from Rob Roy. Here at Trinity Grove, in the sitting room which opened onto the conservatory, I should admire the portraits of the great players whom John and Scott had entertained there. The lovely Peg Woffington, from whose clutches Garrick escaped into the safety of a matrimonial embrace. The witty and delicious Kitty Clive, the mercurial Matthews, and Roman Kemble himself, whose art Sir Walter celebrated in an essay which is much less well known than it should be. He remembered him as Hotspur, fumbling for his words in the confusion of mangled recollections, and the way he darted forward in abuse of Bolingbroke, like a greyhound slipped, like a rocket lighted, like a bolt from a crossbow. He described Kemble's Coriolanus as near perfection as I can conceive a theatrical performance. Yes, I like to think of Scott shaming the midnight hour with the members of my own profession. He remembered Sarah Siddons melting the formidable Geoffrey into tears. Never, he wrote, was there such a night for laundresses. And if Sarah Siddons would hardly have been in place at Trinity Grove, I wish that I could summon her majestic shade into the North British Hotel, hear her lapse into blank verse as Scott had heard her, and round upon a waiter in the tones of Lady Macbeth inciting her husband to regicide, "I asked for porter, you have brought me beer." Scott would not have been displeased at the thought that another player was now feeling his way into To Be or Not to Be from the stage of the Lyceum, or engaged perhaps in some more ribald repartee under the nose of Dr. Knox in the Assembly Hall. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I have here in my hands a snuff box. It's a very utilitarian object. of no more intrinsic value than a well-loved and well-used pipe. But it happened to belong to Sir Walter Scott, and the inscription, engraved in silver, runs as follows: To John Gibson, writer to the signet, from Sir Walter Scott, Bart, Edinburgh, Scotland, 1832. The date will tell you much. Only a few months later, Sir Walter Scott was dead. Gibson had faithfully sustained and advised him through the years of desperate labor, diminished fortune, and physical decline. The years when, as Lockhart sadly admitted, the gentleman survived the genius. This simple token of gratitude, it came down as an heirloom to Lady Rostrevor Hamilton. She had intended to present it to the Scott Museum, but fearing that it might be overlooked among other more spectacular souvenirs, she most graciously gave it to me. I trust that in due course, but not, I hope, too soon, you will allow me to leave it to this society. From whatever corner of purgatory I may then inhabit, I should like to think of it making its ritual passage down the table, and perhaps spattering with a few grains of snuff from Freiburg and Trier those immaculate white waistcoats which so properly and so exceptionally embellish your proceedings. It will remind me, although it need not remind you, of the great honor that you have done me tonight. My Lord Provost, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to raise your glasses to the immortal memory of Sir Walter Scott. Walter Scott.
Walter Scott.